let's say, who want to know more about the story?
Who wants to know more?
Yeah, the story. Which is okay. We're more. We're going to ask, that the Mr. Phil Valenti he's really keeping this deep. What I'm going to say is that Zhao's work that he was performed many times in a very popular, that he picking up. And the reason is that we have to put up a show. Believe it or not, back in 1962, and I was in Shanghai, and then in Hong Kong, and still I guess middle school kids. And then my dad at that time went to see a show in Hong Kong. Hong Kong used to be this movie theater, so cheap. And for those who from Hong Kong, many years ago they say that the theater was Puqing. In the Puqing at that time came from the Peking, and one of the most let's say that all this that these star opera performers put into one. The way that Chinese opera goes, it is not only the story, it is who's performing draws all that crowd. Okay, so when Wei Nanfang was was performing, and he is that everybody come to want to see Wei Nanfang. It is like the old days, when I was growing up, I was priestly, he has all the people want to follow. And that's how that the opera is set up. But each one that the star movies, they have their own opera troupe. And in that time, I would say that there must be thousands of opera troupes spread in China. The reason that is spread in China is the Qing dynasty, okay, and that the Cixi Taihou, what was the English name for her?
Empress Dowager.
Empress Dowager. She loved that the Peking opera because she loved it, and all that her the relatives, the kids, everything, they all loved it. So Mandarin is very popular. That they all love the Peking opera, and they spread it out. So popular, across the country. So that at that time, you have all these different cities, right? And they all have, these operas. Each city in Shanghai, you have maybe like 5, 10, the Peking opera troupes. Everybody has its own, and they have their own draws. That popular. So what I say in 1962, of all that the people who's the star, who now that combined together into one troupe and they perform in 1962, and one of the opera they perform is that the Orphan of Zhao. So when my dad comes back talking about all this thing, I was always since a kid, was always that he admired and waiting for a chance. So at last year, the New York Chinese Opera Society is able to put up this show. And for all these years, my childhood dream came true. So, and particularly today, I have the honor to here standing in front of you, introduce Mr. Phil Valenti, and who is a historian, and he is also that he is a scholar, and he wrote this particular article because he watched this thing, and through his research, and he found out something is more interesting, inspiring, it's just touching to me. Okay, so what we're going to do is that without further ado, we're going to start this time to Phil. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Chi, and everyone for having me. I appreciate it very much. And I love this. I want to see what your reactions are to what I've said and what I'm going to say here. It'll be very interesting to have a dialogue. But now, we're going to discuss, I'd like to discuss the Zhao Shigur's or Orphan of Zhao. On one level, we'll discuss the history of it and the impact in America. And on another level, what we're talking about is really the most important issue facing the world today, which is the relationship between the United States and China. That's the real subject of what this is about to me. And it's not just China, it's also a whole group of nations that China is associated with called the BRICS. Maybe you've heard of Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. They call themselves the BRICS countries. All these countries are working together to form a new financial system in the world, an economic system, new relationship, independent of Wall Street, independent of the city of London, the British, the people who run the world economy. Now there's a new coalition coming on the scene in the world. And the question is, what's going to be the relationship of America to China and to that group of nations? So I'm hoping that what I've discovered about Zhao Shigur, about the Orphan of Zhao, and its relationship to the American Revolution will help to create more cooperation, understanding between the United States and China, instead of conflict, confrontation, which is what some of the people in the US government are doing right now. So when I always wanted to see a Chinese opera. I've seen excerpts on television over the years, and this was my first chance to see Chinese opera live. And of course, I knew nothing about the Orphan of Zhao. I'd never heard of it before. I knew zero. I had never heard of it. So before seeing it, I wanted to do a little research to look up online what it's about. So I found out, I was very surprised to find out, that it was the first Chinese play translated into European language, which was in 1731. That it had a big impact in Europe when it was translated into English and Italian and French, that great artists and poets in Europe were inspired by this Chinese opera to make their own versions of it. And this created a big sensation in Europe. Then I found out that, because I was coming from Philadelphia to see this play that I'd never heard of before, and I found out that it had been performed, the English version had been performed in Philadelphia 250 years ago, in 1767, and then in New York in 1768. So I was wondering, why have I not heard of this if it had been performed, or an English version had been performed in Philadelphia 250 years ago? Now, of course, nothing in my research about it could prepare me for what I actually saw on December 6th, because it was just astounding for me to see this opera. I mean, I was crying, I was cheering, I was applauding, I felt like yelling bravo many times, and extremely moved by this. And sometimes I would just have my mouth hanging open, couldn't believe what I was seeing on the stage and hearing. And I said to myself, as I saw this opera unfold, that this has to be one of the greatest dramatic works in the history of the world. I've been to Italian operas, I've seen plays of Shakespeare and read a lot of it, but could I think of anything to compare to this in terms of the power of it? And I couldn't. I mean, there's powerful operas and excellent operas in the European tradition, civilization, but I said this has to be one of the greatest works in the history of the world. And why have I never heard of it? And I began realizing that I was thinking of myself as knowledgeable and cultured to some degree. I really was ignorant, because if I don't know about Chinese culture, then I'm ignorant, really, of human civilization. So it really shocked me. And I could see in the opera themes that I recognized from Plato, dialogues of Plato, things that I recognized from the Bible, famous stories from the Bible, Greek tragedy, Shakespeare, all these elements I could see in this play. And this is from the 13th century, 1200s, that it was composed. So then I thought about it more, because I do have a background in American history, particularly the period before the American Revolution. And I thought, well, this play is about standing up to tyranny and oppression and sacrificing for justice, and it's performed in America 1767 to 1791, performed at least 8 or 9 times in Philadelphia and New York. That's the American Revolution. And so could this opera have been brought to America to help inspire Americans to stand up against the British the way that Cheng Ying and others stood up against the Tuan Gu? So I said, that's what I was determined to find out. And if that were true, if there was a connection between Chinese culture and the original revolutionary spirit of America, that would be a very powerful way of creating better understanding between the United States and China. So that's how I got started on this. So now just to look at the similarities that I mentioned between the Zhao and drama in Europe, the thing that struck me is the techniques that were used, like the idea of an aside. When you make an aside in a Shakespearean play, the character comes on stage and says something to express their thoughts, and only the audience can hear. The rest of the characters can't hear it. So he comes on the stage, and before he begins speaking, he expresses his innermost thoughts. That was done in Zhao, and that's also done in classical tragedy and plays in Europe. Soliloquies in classical drama in Europe is when the character makes extended speech expressing their thoughts and emotions. And usually they're alone on stage doing that. And that was done. An aria in an opera, in like an Italian opera, the character sings about their own thoughts and emotions. There may be other characters on stage, but the other characters, can't hear that. Only the audience can hear it. Same thing was done in the Zhao. Then the Tuangu threatened to kill all the infants. That's immediately recognizable from the Bible. King Herod killed all the infants in Bethlehem to try to kill Jesus, baby Jesus. That he couldn't find out where Jesus was in Bethlehem. He knew that this quote-unquote king of the Jews had been born. So he said he sent out soldiers to kill all the infants in Bethlehem and the surrounding area. And then Joseph was warned in a dream, and the baby Jesus escaped to Egypt, and then grew up later to do what he did. That was immediately struck me. And then the issue of assassination of the tyrant. Under what conditions can you assassinate the leader of your state? That's a very important question. And that brought up to my mind William Tell by Friedrich Schiller. You've heard of William Tell, who shot the arrow off his son's head in the opera and in the story in the play. And William Tell is in Switzerland, and he assassinates the tyrant and frees the country from the Austrians. So that theme was immediately recognized. But then the first scene of the play, which defines the whole opera, the contrary philosophies of government, where those who are powerful can do what they want with the common people. That some people are the masters and the rest are the slaves. And you can shoot at them and kill them and do what you please. Or the other idea, which is also the Confucian idea, that the foundation of the state is the people, which is what General Wei says in the first scene. He says that this is a fundamental principle of government. The foundation of the state is the people. How American is that? And that is the original doctrine of the United States, which we don't adhere to all the time, of course. But the idea of we the people founded the government, and that's the basis of the nation. The foundation of the state is the people, and the leader should have a father's love for the people. So you immediately have the two contrasting views of government, and then they begin to shoot at the common people for sport, and they're looking at the audience. So it immediately puts the audience in the position of being the common people. We're immediately part of the story. That's the way I saw it. That I'm the common people they're shooting at, and how we're going to free ourselves from these monsters. And that reminded me of a Greek play, which I happened to see last year in Sicily, where the audience becomes the jury. It's the first trial in history started in Greece. And it's clear that the audience of the play is the jury. So the audience is involved immediately in the play. So all these features were immediately similar to European theater. But then the most important was this character of Chen Ying, who I think is one of the greatest figures in literature and in history. It should be studied, like Hamlet, Macbeth, or anybody else in literature all over the world. There's no other character like him. And I knew there was something I recognized about his situation. And I thought about it, researched it, and it comes from Plato's Republic. You know the Greek philosopher Plato, of course, his greatest dialogue called The Republic, and it's about the question of justice. What is justice? That's what that dialogue is about by Plato. And he discusses a situation of, is the just man happier than the unjust man? Because the unjust man could, what if the unjust man gets away with crimes and is never caught, and the unjust man has the reputation of justice? And what about if the just man has the reputation of injustice? He's a just man, but everybody thinks he's unjust. Which is the happier between those two? And the whole Republic is all about that, of Plato. 9 books are discussing that question in Plato. And that's Cheng Ying, right? This is what Plato says. He says, the man doing no injustice, let him have the greatest reputation for injustice, so that his justice may be put to the test, to see if it is softened by bad reputation and its consequences. And then they say, what do you think will happen to this just man? Well, the average person would say, they'll say that the just man who has such a disposition, who has a bad reputation, will be whipped. This is Plato saying this. That man will be whipped. He'll be racked. This just man, who everyone thinks is unjust, he'll be bound. He'll have both his eyes burned out, and at the end, when he has undergone every sort of evil, he'll be crucified. And know that one shouldn't wish to be, but seem to be just. This is from Plato. So this is exactly the Cheng Ying. And of course, in a different way, Socrates himself and Jesus were just men, but they were convicted of crimes and put to death. And to me, the Cheng Ying is a pure example of that. So in those ways, it was very similar to drama, theater, the Bible, Plato, my background. But then if you go into the actual history of the opera, which you can then trace out the history of the relationship between Chinese culture and quote West or Europe, and then later America, by looking at the history of this particular opera. So we start, this is all approximate dates this far back, but approximately 600 BC is when the events took place that are portrayed in the opera. And this is known in Chinese history as the spring and autumn period, where there was no unified dynasty. And of course, people here are much more expert than me on this, but I'll tell you what I've learned about it. Where various powerful families, there's no unified dynasty in China, but there were very powerful families that were competing for powerful positions in various feudal states and dukedoms, basically. This warring states is when some of these families became more powerful and were competing with each other to dominate basically all of China. And then later on, I think it's the Qin dynasty established after this. But this is a period of conflict and chaos when Kongzi, right, Confucius, lived during this period. And later on, Mencius lived as the most important follower of Confucius during this period. So that is all part of one historical process when this play was, the events in the play that occurred. If you skip ahead 1800 years, is when the play was composed by Ji Junxiang. We know the name of the composer. He composed, I believe, if I read correctly, 6 plays. The other 5 are lost. Maybe they can be discovered, but they're lost. And this is a period when the Mongols invaded China and conquered China. So when Genghis Khan conquered what's now Beijing, 1215 AD. Kublai Khan conquered the Song dynasty in the south. And then the Yuan dynasty was established for almost 100 years, 1271 to 1368. This is a period when the Confucian scholars were being repressed and degraded. And of course, it's very famous, Kublai Khan had to adopt much of Chinese culture in order to actually govern in China. Then we skip ahead a few hundred years to the 1730s is when the opera was first translated into European language. 1731, a Jesuit priest, Father Prémar, his name is, translated it into French. And then another priest, Duhand, French Jesuit priest, published it, 4 volumes called The Description of China in 1735, and next year was translated in English. And this description of China had Zhao Shigur translated into French and English. It was published, made a fantastic impact in Europe. It, as I said, hit like a bombshell culturally in Europe. Because in the 1750s, it was adapted, and I'll explain more how it was adapted, and staged in Europe. An Italian version was written by an Italian poet, Pietro Metastasio, who was a famous writer of opera lyrics, basically, libretto. Voltaire, a very famous French author, of course, published or created a French version. And then Arthur Murphy created an English version in 1759. Then, soon after, it was performed in America, as I mentioned, from 1767, the English version of Arthur Murphy, performed in Philadelphia, 1767, New York, 1768, and at least 8 times in New York and Philadelphia between those years, around the American Revolution. And then I have here 2014 was revived, the original Chinese version by New York Chinese Opera Society, and what that's going to lead to, remains to be seen. Hopefully a lot of good will come of that. So now let's look back at this and see the relationship to Europe, or to so-called Western developments in Western philosophy. The one thing that's amazing immediately is that this whole period is the exact same period of the development of Greek philosophy. Pythagoras, Heraclitus, Socrates, Plato is exactly contemporary with these developments of Kongzi and Mengzi in China. It's really amazing. And it raises the question is, what was the communication on the Silk Road of ideas between China and the Mediterranean in that period?
Isn't that the period of Moses too?
I don't know.
Yeah, I think it is, like 600 BC.
Well, it should be grid. We need a nice grid of all the historical developments. That's how you make discoveries, really, in history. So, and the similarity not only of the time period, but of the content of the philosophy. Obviously, both Confucius and the Greek philosophers were philosophers. The first philosopher meaning lovers of wisdom, that the purpose of a human being is to improve their knowledge and to become more knowledgeable and to seek virtue and to try to perfect themselves. And the question of what is knowledge, how does knowledge begin? Socrates said, you have to know that what you don't know. You have to know that you don't know. You have to know that you're ignorant. You can't assume that because you think you know something, that it's true. You have to examine it. Use your reason to examine it. Otherwise, you'd just be expressing prejudices or things you've learned which could be completely wrong. And Confucius said the same thing. There's a quote from the Analects of the sayings of Confucius. He says, shall I teach you the meaning of knowledge? When you know a thing, to recognize that you know it, and when you do not, to know that you do not know. That is knowledge. So that's Confucius, it's also Socrates, the same thing. And of course, the way they taught their disciples was through discussion and dialogue, not through a lecture like what I'm doing, but through a dialogue and discussion. And in fact, let me go to the next slide. I think the next slide is, this is Confucius. This is a statue that's here in Chinatown, which is, I think is very good. It's an excellent quote from Confucius on that statue. And go to the next one. Thank you. That's Confucius teaching. And he's standing by a river. And this is from the Analects and the sayings of Confucius. He said, once when the master was standing by a stream, he observed, all is transient like this, unceasing day and night. Now that's the same thing that Heraclitus said in Greece, that you never step into the same river twice. It's very famous that change is what's fundamental. And of course, Pythagoras, Socrates, Plato also all taught the same thing. The idea of examining your life, that the unexamined life is not worth living. Socrates. Same thing with Confucius, the idea of examining yourself and trying to perfect yourself and make yourself more virtuous, perfect the virtue within you. Then the idea of how to change the government. What is the best government? Well, Plato said the best government is where the philosophers are the kings, where you try to educate the king to be a philosopher. Confucius tried the same thing. And of course, he worked for a duke who was corrupted by 80 beautiful dancing girls. Same thing as the duke in the Zhao. And then Confucius was exiled from that court. And of course, so that they tried that, all of them tried that. Plato did that. Plato went to Sicily to try to educate a tyrant to become a philosopher. So they all failed in their lifetimes. You can turn to the next one. This is Socrates teaching, also the same way, the dialogue. He was convicted and sentenced to death for corrupting the youth. Next one. And so this is Socrates drinking the hemlock. Socrates was condemned to death for corrupting the youth. And this is a famous painting of him drinking the poison. Of course, he's philosophizing about the immortality of the soul in this process, and all of his followers, of course, are completely distraught. He's very calm, about to drink the poison. So they didn't think, so the comparisons there are striking in that period. Now the question of the composition of Zhao, there, the 1200s, even though, there's an irony, because even though the Mongols were brutal conquerors, at the same time they conquered China, they also conquered Russia, or Kiev Rus, and most of Eurasia. And there's famous stories about the brutality of Genghis Khan, etc., that we all know. Ironically, that it unified politically most of Eurasia and led to a flourishing of trade and communication on the Silk Road. So the first documented European visit to China was in this period was Marco Polo. So next one. This is the route that Marco Polo took to China and home again. You see he went over land there with the, got this, the Silk Road over land, and then but also had a sea voyage, maritime Silk Road, so to speak, coming home again. And he was in China under Kublai Khan. Lived under the patronage of Kublai Khan from 1275 to 1292, so almost 20 years in China, and then published The Travels of Marco Polo, which was, again, a big sensation in Europe about the philosophy of China, the wealth of China, and led to a big rush for trade with China. And ultimately, the Europeans tried to find a way to get to China by sailing west instead of east. That's Christopher Columbus. And what did he find instead? Here we are. Okay, now, the next period, don't change yet, but this period, between this, something had to happen in Europe to raise the level of Europe, because Europe had fallen into a dark age at that period of ignorance. Something had to happen to raise the level of Europe so that we could have a dialogue with China. And that was the Italian Renaissance, starting in 1400 AD in Florence, Italy, which was based on the revival of Plato being brought from Greece to Europe, particularly in Italy. It had a major influence on the church, which was the Catholic Church, but was the Christian church at the time. So appropriately, the next great dialogue between China and the West was the first Jesuit mission to China under Matteo Ricci. Now, this is somebody, I'm sure everybody knows about him, but this is going to be, I think he's going to be very important to, in current history, in a relationship between the West, particularly the Catholic Church, Pope Francis, and the Chinese government now. This was an Italian Jesuit priest who went to China, and he lived there from 1582 to 1610, 28 years. And he became Chinese. Here's the next. This is him, Matteo Ricci. He became a Confucian scholar. He was completely fluent in Chinese. He translated the Confucian classics into Latin, I believe. And he wrote a book in Chinese called The True Meaning of the Lord of Heaven, which is written in Chinese, and it was a dialogue between a Confucian scholar and a Western philosopher. It is based on his discussion with the greatest Confucian scholars of the day. And his argument is that the basic philosophy of Christianity was completely comparable to the thoughts of Confucius. Yes.
You don't have a Chinese name?
His name in Chinese is probably not. What is it? Okay,
Is there an English translation of that book?
I'm sure. Sure there is. Now, next slide 2, please. This is his tomb in Beijing. He may have been the first Westerner. He was the first Westerner allowed into the Forbidden City, but he may be the first one that was allowed to be buried in China. Anybody been there? This is a administrative college in maybe the Communist Party college, I'm not sure, in Beijing. That's his tomb. So, and of course, now there's more discussion about Ricci. I'll go into the relationship of the Catholic Church to this, but there's a lot more discussion now about Ricci in the Vatican. Pope Francis, of course, is a Jesuit. He's the first Jesuit pope. And Ricci was a Jesuit, also, from that same religious order. So, French Jesuits went to China, following up Ricci in 1687, 1699, later on in the 17th century. And one of the French Jesuits, named Bouvet, he argued extensively that Chinese philosophy was compatible with Christianity. And he said that the big issue was the rites, the Chinese rites honoring ancestors and honoring Confucius looked like to Westerners like religious worship of them as gods. And Bouvet and the Jesuits, no, that's not what it is. These are civil ceremonies having to do with the social relations. It's not worship of gods. And other Catholic orders said, no, this is pagan superstition. And this was called the Chinese rites controversy. This is the biggest controversy in the Catholic Church at that time. And one of the champions of China, of good relation with China, at that time was a Protestant named Gottfried Leibniz. This is somebody that is not well known in America because he was a big opponent of the English philosophers, the British philosophers. So in America, we're taught to love the British philosophers and English philosophers, which is crazy. But Leibniz was the greatest one. And there's the next slide, isn't it? This is Leibniz. Here he's talking to the Queen of Prussia, explaining to her his plan for the Berlin Academy of Sciences. Leibniz created academies of sciences all over Europe. So Leibniz was a universal genius. Anybody know the calculus? The calculus we use today in mathematics was invented by Leibniz. The binary number system, anybody use computers here? The binary system was invented by Gottfried Leibniz. And he says he discovered it, that the Chinese actually invented it. That's what he says. But he's the one who, let's say, developed it to be used in later use in computers. He was a statesman, also dynamics. He invented the science of dynamics, which is the basis for industrial technology. He had a discussion with a French scientist. Together they invented the first steam engine in 1690. So this was Leibniz. Plus he was a statesman. He was a key advisor to some aristocrats in Europe and had the idea that there should be no world empire. There should be no British empire. You should have different nations, sovereign nations, working together through scientific cooperation, economic development, and knowledge. And that way you can have universal peace. And he did a lot to try to accomplish that during his lifetime as a diplomat. So in 1697, he published a book about China called, in Latin, Novissima Sinica. It's called The Latest News from China. And it was based on the reports of all the Jesuit missionaries over many decades. And in the beginning, he wrote the preface to it. And the preface is amazing because it sounds like today. He's talking about today. He says, I consider it a singular plan of the fates that human civilization and refinement should today be concentrated, as it were, in the two extremes of our continent, in Europe and in China, which adorns the Orient as Europe does the opposite edge of the earth. Perhaps supreme providence has ordained such an arrangement so that as the most cultivated and distant peoples stretch out their arms to each other, those in between may gradually be brought to a better way of life. He says, I do not think it an accident that the Muscovites, the Russians, whose vast realm connects Europe and China, should be led to the emulation of our ways through the strenuous efforts of their present ruler. And of course, the ruler was Peter the Great, Emperor of Russia, who was a more or less a student of Leibniz. Peter the Great asked Leibniz to set up the Russian Academy of Sciences in St. Petersburg. So Leibniz was organizing the Russians to play that role of a bridge between China and Europe. Sounds like today. Then Leibniz also was amazed at the level of culture in China of the common people. He says, who would have believed that there is on earth a people who, though we are, in our view, so very advanced in every branch of behavior, they still surpass us in comprehending the precepts of civil life. Yet now we find this to be so among the Chinese, as we learn to know them better. And so, if we are their equals in the industrial arts and ahead of them in contemplative sciences, certainly they surpass us, though it is almost shameful to confess this, in practical philosophy, that is, in the precepts of ethics and politics adapted to the present life and use of mortals. Indeed, it is difficult to describe how beautifully all the laws of the Chinese, in contrast to those of other peoples, are directed to the achievement of public tranquility and the establishment of social order, so that men shall be disrupted in their relations as little as possible. And he talks about the common people. How do the common people relate to each other in China? As our people have noticed in amazement, the Chinese peasants and servants, when they bid farewell to friends, or when they first enjoy the sight of each other after a long separation, behave to each other so lovingly and respectfully that they challenge all the politeness of European magnates. Thus it happens that scarcely anyone offends another by the smallest word in common conversation. Is that so true? And they rarely show evidences of hatred, wrath, or excitement. With us, respect and careful conversation last for hardly more than the first days of a new acquaintance. Scarcely even that. Soon familiarity moves in, and circumspection is gladly put away for a sort of freedom, which is quickly followed by contempt, backbiting, anger, and afterwards enmity. It is just the contrary with the Chinese. Neighbors and even members of a family are so held back by a hedge of custom that they're able to maintain a kind of perpetual courtesy. And so Leibniz argued that the Confucian philosophy is Christianity, is pure Christianity in practice. Practical application of Christian principles. And he concludes in a way that I really endorse. He said, well, now our Jesuit missionaries are educating the emperor in the higher sciences. If this process continues, I fear we may soon become inferior to the Chinese in all branches of knowledge. I do not say this because I grudge them new light. Rather, I rejoice. But it is desirable that they in turn teach us those things which are especially in our interest, the greatest use of practical philosophy and a more perfect manner of living, to say nothing now of their other arts. Certainly the condition of our affairs, slipping as we are into ever greater corruption, seems to be such that we need missionaries from the Chinese who might teach us the use and practice of natural religion, just as we have sent them teachers of revealed theology. So that's Leibniz. Now Leibniz was very relevant to America because he actually was the most important philosophical influence on America. He was the minister to the woman who was next in line to be Queen of England. Unfortunately, she died too soon to ascend to the throne. But Leibniz was very important in English politics, and his major influence turned out to be in Pennsylvania. This is William Penn, the founder of Pennsylvania. This is a famous painting of his treaty with the Indians, Lenni Lenape Indians, which was the most peaceful relationship with Indians that existed ever in America. So Penn was a Quaker. A religious order started in England, and they were dissenters. They were opposed to the Church of England, to the established church. You know, the established Church of England, the Queen and the King is the head of it. So it's purely a political thing. So the Quakers were opposed to that. And they said that there's an inner light within every person which leads us to benevolence and love for our neighbors if it's educated properly. So that benevolence and love for others was a natural condition of man if it's educated. That's the Quakers. That should sound familiar also from China. The next one. This is James Logan was William Penn's secretary. He became the leader of Pennsylvania after Penn died. This is somebody I'm expert on, and he wrote a book critical of all of English philosophers, Hobbes, Locke, Isaac Newton. And Logan then became the biggest influence on the next person, Benjamin Franklin. So Benjamin Franklin, of course, was the most important leader later on of the American Revolution. Now, what happened in this situation with the Jesuits is the Pope in 1704 ruled against the Jesuits and said the Chinese rites are pagan superstition. We said missionaries should tell the Chinese to stop worshiping their ancestors and stop honoring Confucius. That was not going to work. So the emperor banned the missionaries after that. And now, of course, that's totally changed now. In fact, in my church 2 weeks ago, the priest gave a homily about Confucius. You know, to explain the scriptures, he started with a quote from Confucius. But now Pope Francis is talking about Matteo Ricci again. But the Jesuits were expelled from China, but this Father Premier persevered in his studies and translated out of all the plays, maybe there were hundreds of Chinese plays available at the time, he chose the Zhao to translate into French, and then was published, as I said, 1735, 1736, and hit Europe like a cultural bombshell, and began to be adapted into various languages. Now, there's Pietro Metastasio. His play was called L'Eroe Cinese, in Italian, the Chinese hero, and it was performed in Vienna before the Empress of Austria. Voltaire, French writer, wrote a play called L'Orphelin de la Chine, The Orphan of China. Now, he changed the story a lot, and this became a real issue in European politics. I'll just tell you what his version of the story was. His version of the story was there was a Chinese orphan that when the Mongols, his play took place in the 1200s, not 600 BC. And the Mongols had conquered China, and Genghis Khan had killed the whole Chinese royal family except for one orphan boy. And Genghis Khan fell in love with, there was a Confucian scholar who took the orphan to protect the orphan, and then had his wife work with him to protect the orphan. Genghis Khan falls in love with the wife of the Confucian scholar. This is the French version. And she very nobly refuses to have anything to do with him. And he's so impressed that he changes his heart and says, okay, I'll adopt the orphan and raise him as my son. The end. Now that's totally different, of course, than Joshua, but it really was very popular in France and became a big sensation in Europe. So it was published, translated into English and published in England in 1755. Now, England and France were the major competing powers of Europe. So this Zhao Shigur became an issue in European politics. Between England, who was going to produce the best version of Zhao Shigur? The French, Voltaire, could the English rise to the occasion and produce a better Orphan of China? So Arthur Murphy was a playwright born in Ireland. He took up the challenge, and he used the same setting as Voltaire. But he produced an English version, which, in the source that I read, this is an article from 1953 about the original Orphan of China, very authoritative. this Chinese scholar believes that the English version was the closest to the original Chinese spirit, which I think is true. So the Arthur Murphy story it's also takes place under the Mongols. This Timur Khan, he has a fictional Mongol ruler named Timur Khan, who's massacred the Chinese royal families, and this scholar, Confucian scholar, and his wife have protected this one orphan and exchanged their own son with the orphan. They sent their own son into exile, and they said, that's the orphan, he's exiled, he's in Korea, too far away. And the one we have is our son, but that was really the orphan. This 20 years, the play takes place 20 years later, where the orphan is now 20 years old. And essentially what happens is that this Confucian scholar organized a revolution of the Chinese people. He reveals to the orphan his true identity, who then becomes a leader of an uprising of the Chinese people against the Mongols. And the orphan slays the Mongol tyrant Timur Khan and frees the Chinese people and restores the justice in China. That's the story of Arthur Murphy. Now, this is the version that was performed in 1759 in the most prestigious theater in London. It was performed 9 times within a few weeks. The greatest actors, English actors of the day, performed the roles of the Confucian scholar and his wife. So it was very famous in England, and it was part of a conflict between France and England. Arthur Murphy wrote a letter to Voltaire. Voltaire wrote a letter back. It was all published in England, and who was in England at that time was Benjamin Franklin. Now Franklin was involved in all that. He was in the middle of all of English politics. He knew these actors, and they were his friends. So, same year, 1759, as far as world politics, is the year that the British conquered Quebec. The big conflict in England and France was over Canada in North America. The French had a base in Canada, and they were at war who would control North America. So the English won that. They kicked the French government out of Canada. And then, once the French threat was gone from North America, the English began looking at their American colonies and said, okay, no more Mr. Nice Guy. Now you have to pay. Because the British had made concessions to the American colonies as long as the French threat was there. They had to keep them happy to fight the French. Once the French were gone, they didn't have to do that anymore, so the British began coming down with an iron fist on the American colonies, starting in 1763, when the French-British War was over. And they started to put down the taxes to pay for the war, the taxes to pay for the British Army, because the British wanted to have the world empire to dominate the world, and the North American colonies were going to have to pay for that. So the taxes began coming down starting in 1764. Let me show the next slide. And the American reaction, I'll show you, this was oh no, I forgot to show you this. This is, put the back on here, there you go. Yeah, this is actually from the Orphan of China by Arthur Murphy, the English one that was published in 1759. That's Timur Khan, that's the Mongol tyrant. And on the right there, that's the Confucian scholar, the hero, and his wife. There. It's a whole tragic story about how she stabs herself, thinking that all was lost and all was not lost. He's tortured to death, and he inspires the orphan to become a great leader for China. So that's from the Orphan of China, the English version. Okay, now you can do that. So this was the American reaction to these. It wasn't just taxes. It was also that the British Parliament prohibited any manufacturing in America. We had to buy everything from England, could not manufacture anything ourselves. And also prevent us from moving west. We had to stay along the coast because they wanted us to be weak colonies providing agricultural products and buying their overpriced manufactured goods. To be a colony like India was for so long. And the United States would have been like India, maybe never free until 1949, unless we had done it then. So this is the American reaction to the Stamp Act. Stamp Act was 1765, where the British put a tax on every piece of paper sold in America. birth certificate, marriage license, death certificate, pamphlets, newspapers, playing cards, everything had to have a stamp to pay a tax on every piece of paper. Next one. So they were burning the stamps. It's happened all over America and American colonies. 1765. In 1766, Benjamin Franklin testified in England to repeal the Stamp Act, and they did repeal it because it was too much of a reaction, but they began putting different taxes later on. They continued and asserted their right to continue to exploit the American colonies. So keep going. Yeah, this is the Americans chasing these English authorities. See, this man's carrying this a scepter. He represents the authority of the king. And the Americans don't seem to have much respect for the king. Now we do. With Downton Abbey, we have plenty of respect for Royal Queen, unfortunately. But then we had a better attitude. Okay, next one. Then, of course, 1770, the Boston Massacre, where there were demonstrations against the British, and these British redcoats fired on a crowd, killing several Americans. Next one. 1773, the Boston Tea Party. The British East India Company was given a monopoly on tea for America to drain us of wealth to buy their tea. Of course, the tea came from China. America had no basis for trading with China directly. We had to go through England. So the Americans got together one day in 1773 and started dumping the tea, which later on the Chinese did too with the British opium. Same thing. Same thing. Next one. So in 1776, this is July 4, 1776, in Philadelphia, the signing of the Declaration of Independence from China. This is Benjamin Franklin, right there, who was the leader of the committee that drafted the Declaration of Independence. Okay, next one. And of course, the British, when the Declaration was being signed, the British landed all their troops on Long Island, not far from here, and drove Washington out of Brooklyn into Manhattan, drove them out of Manhattan into New Jersey, drove them all across New Jersey, across to Delaware and Pennsylvania. It looks like we were beat. And then Washington, then on the day after Christmas, Christmas night, this was, 1776, crossed back a surprise attack in Trenton, New Jersey. This is the famous painting of Washington crossing the Delaware. And had a victory against the British, the Hessian mercenaries, German mercenaries, on the day after Christmas, 1776. And no casualties on the American side. No one injured or killed in that victory. Next. And this is my favorite. 1781, the British surrender to the Americans and the French. This is the white flag. This is Yorktown, Virginia. The French helped us. They moved their fleet to box in the British Army on the peninsula at Yorktown. It's nice to go there. You see, you still have all the cannon that the British had to surrender. A lot of them are still there on display. So this is an accepting surrender of the British Army. Next one. This is George Washington being sworn in as president, first president of the United States. This is in April of 1789. You know what that is? That's Trinity Church. That's right down the block. This is the second Trinity Church. The one there is a third Trinity Church. I just went down there to look and read about that. The first Trinity Church was burned down by the British when they occupied New York in 1776. So we built a new one, which is under construction, when Washington was sworn in, right down the street. And the next one. This is modern day Philadelphia, but this is Independence Hall on Chestnut Street, between 6th and 5th. And that's where the Declaration of Independence was signed and the US Constitution was written there. But this is the president's house. This is where George Washington lived, because Philadelphia was the first capital under the Constitution from 1790 to 1800. And the president's house was recently excavated, like the early White House in Philadelphia. So Washington and his family lived here on Market Street, 6th and Market Street. Now I showed these slides because in every stage, virtually every stage you saw, the Orphan of China was being performed in either Philadelphia or New York. Right after the inauguration of Washington, right after Philadelphia became the capital, during the British occupation of New York, during one of these riots were occurring. The Orphan of China was performed at least 8 times between those years, 1767 to 1791. And so, and I'll just quote from the Orphan of China, and you could see how Americans would compare themselves to the Chinese and the British to the Mongols. All right? Here, this is a quote from the English Orphan of China, Arthur Murphy. This is Timur Khan, the Mongol tyrant, has captured the Confucian scholar named Zamti, that's his name, and he's got him as a prisoner. And Timur Khan says to the Confucian scholar, "Yes, learn to fear my will, my sovereign will, which here is law, and treads upon the neck of slaves." Now Americans would see that was the British attitude in the leading up to the American Revolution. The British will, king and the parliament, is law. Your legislatures have nothing to say about it. So Zamti replies, "Thy will, the law in China, ill-instructed man. Now learn an awful truth. Though ruffian power may for a while suppress all sacred order and trample on the rights of man, the soul, which gave our legislation life and vigor, shall still subsist above the tyrant's reach. The spirit of the laws can never die." So you see Americans in that period responding to them. Then the wife of the Confucian scholar protests about monarchy. She protests against the idea of monarchs having to sacrifice her son for the sake of a monarch. She says, our kings, what are the sceptered rulers of the world? Formed of one common clay. Are they not all doomed with each subject, with the meanest slave, to drink the cup of human woe? Alike, all leveled by affliction, sacred kings. 'Tis human policy sets up their claims. Mine is a mother's cause. Mine is the cause of husband, wife, and child. Those tenderest ties, superior to your right divine of kings. There's many other quotes from the English version which echo what the Americans were saying during that period of the American Revolution. So my view, my strong hypothesis that Benjamin Franklin knew this play in England and arranged for it to come to America, specifically to help to organize and inspire Americans to stand up against what the British were doing. Now, did Ben Franklin know about this play? Absolutely, it's in his library. His library still exists in Philadelphia, and you can look up the index online. And all the books we've been talking about, the Orphan of China, the Voltaire version, the letters back and forth, the history of China, all of that were in Franklin's library, and also the Library Company of Philadelphia was a subscription library set up by Franklin and James Logan in 1731, and they had all these books in their library. So they knew very well. Now, what was Benjamin Franklin's attitude towards China? I think the most striking example of his attitude towards China is what he said in 1784, later on, because he had studied this English 4-volume book called The General History of China, which was a collection of all the Jesuit missionaries' writings. And he wrote to his daughter. Franklin was concerned that George Washington had set up a new organization called the Society of the Cincinnati. Very famous group, they did a lot of good, but they were Revolutionary War officers of the American Army, and they were going to get badges to show that they were officers, and they were going to hand down the badges to their children, and then to their children and their children. So Franklin didn't like that. He said, the Chinese have a better idea. Here's what he said. This is what he wrote to his daughter, Ben Franklin. Thus, among the Chinese, the most ancient, and from long experience, the wisest of nations, honor does not descend to the children, but ascends, goes up to the parents. If a man from his learning, his wisdom, or his valor is promoted by the emperor to the rank of mandarin, his parents are immediately entitled to all the same ceremonies of respect from the people that are established as due to the mandarin himself, on this supposition that it must have been owing to the education, instruction, and good example afforded him by his parents that he was rendered capable of serving the public. This ascending honor is therefore useful to the state, as it encourages parents to give their children a good and virtuous education. But the descending honor to posterity who could have had no share in obtaining it is not only groundless and absurd, but often hurtful to that posterity, since it is apt to make them proud, disdaining to be employed in useful arts, and then falling into poverty and all the meanness, servility, and wretchedness attending it, which is the present case with much of what is called the nobility in Europe. I wish, therefore, that the Cincinnati, if they must go on with their project, would direct the badges of their order to be worn by their parents, instead of handing them down to their children. It would be a good precedent. It might have good effects. It would also be a kind of obedience to the fourth commandment, in which God enjoins us to honor our father and our mother, but has nowhere directed us to honor our children. So what Franklin is saying is that the Chinese example is a more pure form of Republican virtue than what George Washington was doing. Amazing. As I said from the beginning, now we bring us to 2014. New York Chinese Opera Society has revived the opera in America, has put the English subtitles on it, and what I'm hoping is that these discoveries and the spreading of this opera, the DVD of the opera, could help to promote the understanding and cooperation between the U.S. and China that could have a huge impact in history right now. And so that's Franklin. This is a great portrait of Franklin. They said about Benjamin Franklin, he stole lightning from the heavens because he showed that lightning was really electricity. And he stole the scepter from tyrants. Next one. And this is what I was talking about before, the BRICS. Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, forming the core of a new world financial system, a very good one based on economic development, not on exploitation, and the relationship of nations as equals, and not of master and slave or dominance and subservience. So that the question of what is America's relationship going to be to that is the key issue for the world today. So again, in some way, maybe this discussion of Zhao Shigur, if we could spread this around, would help promote a good outcome to this. So thank you.
In your research, did you run across any other plays or anything that had an equal impact on our history, or is that something you're going to further do, research?
No, certainly no Chinese play.
No Chinese?
Although if this one was so great, it's got to be another great one. I'm really excited to learn, to see more of them. But as I said, when I saw this one, I was so moved. And Yan was sitting next to me. She knows I was crying, cheering, applauding. And as I said, I couldn't believe it. I said to myself immediately at the end, this is one of the greatest dramatic masterpieces, in the history of the world. How is it I don't know that? So I think hopefully more people will ask themselves that question.
Interesting.
Gee, you want to share that?
That's a question.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, anyway, I was just thinking when you were reading some of the quotes, like 10 minutes ago, this is totally similar to the inalienable rights of man in the Declaration of Independence and our Constitution. It's the same idea. It's a universal idea that Schiller picked up on in the play William Tell. Our rights are in the heavens, that it's not given to us by, men or compacts or whatever. And this is a universal idea that's common to every culture. It's really a beautiful thing.
I agree, but I rather that feel that you also did this comment.
Well, especially the Confucian culture or Confucian attitude. As I said, the first scene of the play defines it right there, when General Wei comes and makes that statement that the fundamental principle is the foundation of the state is the people.
So I teach in the church, gospel class. Oftentimes, we use Chinese culture, like in the original Chinese, the history goes back, the history, and a few thousand years ago, the first few kings, they are not passed on from the father to the son, but actually, they elected the most capable and most that the kind person of the nation to become the leader. The first three leaders that I know, they are not have no relationship.
What were their names?
That the
Yao
Yao,
Fengyu.
Sun
Yao
Yu,
Fengyu.
that and then eventually when you go to that the museum, you see that the Zhou dynasty, Song dynasty, Xia dynasty, and then they started to pass on to the son. And then when you go to the Qing dynasty, and then in the beginning, that Chinese the king, they don't have. This is that the say the king. When Qing dynasty when they come, he added the son on top. What he's saying is that his name is that Chen Qing. Okay. Shi is beginning here, is started anew. I mean, he is the one that completed the whole Chinese, the territory, the current, okay, that the territory. And he thinks that he replaced himself as the son of the heaven, son of the heaven, which is in many sense is what Japan uses, son of the heaven. They think, so when you go to Beijing and you go to the temple, that is that the spring day, he will be the one represent all the subjects and pray to God for the peace, prosperity of the whole nation. So but in the old days also is that Confucius saying is that you are supposed to respect the elders as your own mother. You're taking care of the babies as your own daughter. That is what they call the great love, right? And in some way, this is an act. That's the Bible teaching. It's just that you love can unify the whole thing. Except as time goes on, things is only changed. So I think that God is just that the very humorous. The Chinese from that the Manchuria. And the Manchuria, that because there's many stories, they close themselves, they think that they're the middle kingdom, center of the universe. They don't want to hear anybody else. They're isolated until British forced the opening, hold that on the coastline, and then until that Sun Yat-sen that throw them and started that the republic until the Mao Zedong comes. All these things, ancestor worshiping is getting worse and worse as time goes on. Mao Zedong is the one that throw them all away, says no more. So which means is that at that time, all the young people that during the Cultural Revolution, that religion, the ancestor thing is going away. But except with the Deng Xiaoping right now, economy, power, everything goes back 10 times worse. But I can tell you, I was in Shanghai for a year and 7 months. Church is thriving. The reason I went to the church, every time we go to a church, it was built by British, this was a pre-war. And when we go there, every time they have, in the morning, they have 7:30 service, right? And in order to get a seat, you have to be there at least 45 minutes before you get a seat. Otherwise, you have to, go to another side church, watch the TV like that. And the main hall, that can be maybe about 400 people, 500 people, and that is British, the British built. You have the horseshoe on the top, okay, and then you have the main, and that's it about 400. And at the side church, there's 2 floors. Each one is maybe about 300. So that adds almost like 1,000. And plus another place, a social hall, this is a couple hundred. That's 7:30. Then you have 10:30. You have the 2 in the afternoons for all the aspects. You have to show the passport to go in. And at night, another one, 7:30, 5. Each one of them is full. And when they were baptized, you know, that the believers, every time, whenever we went, 3 or 4 times we went, a few hundred people lined up, get baptized. So I think that God is, you know, in some ways, many, you know, God is go through all these things, but in some ways, that religion nowadays is thriving. That's the thing. But of course, some of them churches want to making sure it's not, so they kind of want to cool. The only thing is the churches you can do, but they do not like to have a group assembly of more than 25 people. So that the church we're going to is that we go to the service, but the whole Shanghai, each district, you have different cell group. And a group is just that you get together. And then you go into, and they have a cell group, and the cell group is very strong. And they really bring the love, that the Confucius, you know, give that we believe that Sioux wrote. You will believe that the Adam and Eve is, you know, is that the beginning of the human race. There is some kind of commonality, you know, among all these things. I can tell you that when, as a Christian, as a Chinese, you know, being growing up, I was born in Shanghai, grew up in Hong Kong, and then educated in the United States. I love to compare. A lot of things you said about similarity, we're talking about that love, the respect, and you know things. The further you go up, the more common that you can see. And you know, so the love is the common thing. Unfortunately, the economy, the power, the greed destroys everything.
That's Wall Street.
Is there any,
Wall Street, yes.
is there any possibility that the New York Chinese Opera Society is working to perform this in Philadelphia?
You know what? Philadelphia has a Chinese Opera Society too. The Philadelphia the Opera Society. We would love to make an introduction to film, so that we can see. But produce a show like that takes a major undertaking because it takes like 60 people to produce the show, and it's a lot of work. And I'm not sure that Philadelphia is able to produce all by itself. And also it depends on the major character. The person who was the Cheng Ying, who was the youth troupe director of National Opera from Beijing. And he was good, you know, the way that he's into the world.
Will it be played again? We did not see it.
Well, no.
Let me mention one thing too, is that there is a group in New York that's trying to have the United States join with the BRICS and China. This is I brought some of these pamphlets of the Schiller Institute and having events in New York City. And in fact, Helga Zeppelin-Rusch, who's the leader of it, was covered in Xinhua. They cover her regularly in the Chinese press, what she's doing. But so if you're interested more, I have some more of these pamphlets.
So, well, actually, you missed that, but you know, that was the 8th, you know, annual festival that we performed in the winter time. This year, we're going to perform the 9th, you know, festival in November. November 7th,
Right.
St. Page University, not the Orphan of Zhao, a different
It's a comedy.
comedy. Different opera comedy, don't miss that. And the film is returning to the nest, the type of more or less, you know, in a nutshell, it's a comedy. That the leading actress is from Shanghai, a young lady, and who will be performing actually a complete entire opera, about 2 hours. And the scale is pretty much the same as Qi represented before. A major taking, but not only in terms of the personnel, organization, everything, but also financially. So I suppose if you put your name and we give it to Yilin and an email, and we'll put you informed, and don't miss the November 7th, which is a Saturday afternoon. Perfect. 2 p.m.
Excellent.
Has this opera?
Yeah, why do you think the Voltaire and English version changed to the Mughal period?
Why did it change that?
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, Voltaire is the one who did it.
Yeah.
And perhaps it would be more grand rather than just one family or one little part of
easier to
China.
resonate with the population at the time when you're talking about Mongols since they experienced it.
Because the Mongol thing was known in Europe, and this was a grander opera that had all of China and the outside invasion of the Mongols. And Genghis Khan was very well known, so probably it was a grander theme rather than just focusing on one family in a small part of China. Probably that's why.
It's also unique.
But it really became.
Little kingdom.
It became. I really want to emphasize that it became this Zhao in this form became a big political issue of Europe. There was a big cultural battle between England and France over this opera. So maybe you probably didn't realize that when you produced it here. I didn't know, of course, anything about it, but it was much bigger than we thought.
All I know is I went to Hungary, right? And then I was in Budapest, right in the hall, the city hall, the center, right, square. There's a Mongol with the Mongols all walking around, some of the things they think that some of the ancestors is just that the Mongol troop was left behind. So I guess it's that in Europe it's easier, people that feel they know the Mongols much better, better connections for that.
So I don't know if the English realized that it would have this effect in America. Of course.
Well, does anybody here like to sing?
Sing?
Sing, the Messiah.
Messiah.
I belong to a group that we have a sing-along Messiah once a week. During the choir
Handle.
session. Yeah, Handel. If anybody wants to, just grab one. We sing in Manhattan every evening.
Oh, okay. I thought you were going to pass on this.
Are you saying when you're in? Yeah, keep singing it.
Anybody like one of these?
So
It's great, it's open to the public, it's great.
Movement to the U.S. to join China.
So that the Chinese opera, the New York Chinese Opera Society is that the main purpose is really to become a bridge and that we bring the Chinese opera to the mainstream. So we wanted that everybody share. So a lot of times I tell my American friends, I says, look, you want to understand Chinese culture, come to watch a play. Because in the play, you can see all the virtues of the Chinese culture, in the old days. But we still pressure this thing. I have to say is that Confucius' teaching, in many ways, have a big influence in all the surrounding countries, states. So if you look at Japanese and Koreans, in many ways, what their customs are, you can see the reflection of the virtues of the Confucius teaching. That is respect and that be courteous. So this is something is just that, I think that it's just good to have instead of to be this fighting for your share, but sometimes to just like the Bible teaching, giving is loving. Really, this is something that is just very important.
I just have a question for Phil. One thing I didn't hear you, I was waiting for maybe, since you were making the comparisons of China and America. Of course, this is about opera, but you brought in so many other things. And I think about the rapid development right now of China. There was the book by a Pennsylvania author about Li Gui, the Chinese, he was the first sanctioned Chinese, representative to the centennial in Philadelphia, the celebration of the Do you have anything to say about that?
Well, that's a whole other subject, but it's a whole subject to be studied. But yeah, in the 1870s, there were about 200 Chinese boys who studied at Yale University in schools in New England. And they came to Philadelphia in 1876 to meet President Grant and to attend the Centennial Exhibition, which was a huge world exhibition on the 100th anniversary of American independence and celebrating American industry, the fact that we had surpassed the British in manufacturing and achieved all these things. And they came from Yale to meet President Grant, and they talked about sending Americans to China to study there. And this, of course, was later on spoiled because different presidents. The other thing I wanted to mention about Zhao Shigur is what I thought of when I saw the opera was, look how many presidents were like that Duke, who were stupid or corrupt or fools and were manipulated by evil advisors. And that's happened too much in American history. So that's what immediately came to mind in seeing that portrayed on stage. So that's what happened in the 1870s, 1880s. Different presidents spoiled it, the British spoiled it. But there was a beginning of a very close relationship also in that period, the 1870s.
That in that Zhao Shigur, the story is a little different. Is that his own son that he replaced that the Zhao Shigur as his own son, and then so when the tyrant, the Duke, killed the baby, was believed to be Zhao Shigur, actually his own son. He saved the person with his own life. Now that's Christianity.
Yeah.
And then what happened is that when he grew up, and then because it's that everybody is accusing of he's selling out his friend, okay, for getting his money, okay, the wealth and the power. So therefore he's being despised in the whole country, but he made the sacrifice for almost how many years? 17 years, 18 years. Right. So therefore he endured that, so as to become a just, but being blamed on unjust, living on under this shame for 17 years. Until one day, when he sees the right opportunities, the general, that he coming back, and the way that he said, you betrayer, that the human junk, and he was whipping him. As being whipped, he was laughing with joy. He's saying that, look, when you're whipping me, now I can trust you. Then he tells the story about what he did. And because the baby's hand has a same kind of birthmark, and then he has certain things to prove the baby is actually something. So because the mother is the princess of the Duke, so therefore there's a sister. This is related, this is the emperor. So therefore, what happened is she did not die, but the mother knows the birthmark. When they really find out that the child is not that the kid, his own kid, and that's how it leads to. But think about someone who endured 17 years of this belittling and protecting the secret, and for the justice.
There's a lot of, in Chinese opera, different themes. And of course, this one is a tragedy. And there's a comedy, but nevertheless, whether it's tragedy or comedies, they're all based on ethnic virtue, and then all of what we believe. So there's a lot of tradition, a lot of folklore, a lot of things that's dear to the Chinese culture, that's as reflected on stage. And we are lucky in the sense that we have a chance to really, being that, grew up, with watching Chinese opera. Not necessarily so for the younger generation, that we will hope that we can basically bring this to them. But more importantly, here in New York, in America, New York Chinese Opera Society, as Qi said, that we have a mission that we want to promote Peking opera. How to promote? How to bridge? I guess we need to really get a lot of advices from Nancy Philip, Frank, and then you. And the key is that if Philip do not watch, probably there's no way that you can experience that or we can bring it to you. And then we try very hard to see how we can bring it to you. And I guess through diners with you, maybe we can learn something. And maybe Phyllis can share with us. I feel earlier you said you watch maybe some, not live on stage, but DVD.
Yeah, I've seen it on television over the years.
Television, but other Americans might not even watch the television or DVD, right?
Right.
I mean, do you have any idea as to
Well,
how?
I think, well, if you can think of ways we can publish this article.
That's one way. Yes. Yeah, and I know that's always, initial step. Once you get through it, because when the first year we put through these performances, and then when Americans, as some maybe young people who never really watch it, and then they experience it and they are really fabricators. And then we have enough confidence, but just how to bring it to the stage.
You know what, it's 4 o'clock, it's too early. I have to ask Eugene. Eugene, do you think this is a good idea? We still have costumes in the other side of the office, right?
Yeah.
What I like to do is, for those who wish, okay, we can put that the Chinese, that opera costume, and you can have a photo. That's our appreciation for your coming. Any more questions?
Very good.